Frank Calloway's life had narrowed to a single, grinding rhythm long before the letter arrived. Every morning began in darkness, with an alarm that felt less like a sound and more like a command to endure another day. At 52, his body had memorized fatigue. His hands moved automatically through routines shaped by years of janitor shifts, warehouse aisles, and late-night driving for strangers who never learned his name. He lived in a small apartment where silence lingered heavily, broken only by the hum of old appliances and the echo of memories he tried not to touch. A framed photograph on the wall showed a younger man beside a smiling woman and a boy with sandy hair. Frank rarely looked at it for long. Grief had a way of reopening itself when given too much attention. His son hadn't called in years, and Frank told himself that distance was easier than disappointment. Bills stacked neatly on the counter, always paid late, never fully gone. Life wasn't dramatic anymore, it was practical, stripped of hope and ambition. He believed this was what survival looked like, quiet, invisible, and relentless. So when the cream-colored envelope appeared among overdue notices and advertisements, Frank almost threw it away. It looked too formal, too intentional, like it belonged to someone else's life. Only curiosity, thin and stubborn, made him open it. Inside were words that didn't fit his reality: inheritance, property, family he didn't remember. The amount listed was laughable, almost insulting. $20, a worthless building. Frank exhaled slowly, unaware that this insignificant letter was already loosening the walls he had built around his heart. The lawyer's voice on the phone was polite, efficient, and utterly detached from the weight those words carried. Frank listened as if the conversation were happening to someone else. A distant relative, a building abandoned for decades, no value, no obligation. The facts were delivered cleanly, leaving no room for hope. Frank thanked the man and hung up, staring at the letter long after the call ended. He felt foolish for even considering it. Taking a day off meant lost wages, late payments, and uncomfortable explanations. Yet something unsettled him, a quiet question he couldn't shake. Why would anyone hold onto a worthless building for 30 years? That question followed him through mopped hallways and warehouse aisles, through long drives and empty meals. He mentioned it casually to a coworker who listened longer than expected, then said something simple that stuck. "You've got nothing to lose by looking." Those words lingered. Frank had lived his life minimizing risk, believing responsibility meant endurance, not curiosity. His son had once accused him of that, of never taking chances, of mistaking survival for living. Frank had dismissed it then. Now, alone in his apartment with the letter folded beside unpaid bills, the accusation felt uncomfortably true. When the keys arrived in the mail, old brass worn smooth by time, Frank held them as if they belonged to another era. He searched the town online and saw images of empty streets and shuttered buildings. The place looked like memory made physical. Against reason, Frank requested a day off. The decision felt reckless, almost wrong, yet something in his chest loosened as he packed a flashlight, tools, and a lunch bag. For the first time in years, he wasn't driving to work. He was driving toward the unknown. The town greeted him with silence and decay, as though time itself had slowed out of respect for what had been lost. Frank parked across from the building and sat for several minutes, engine idling, staring at what little remained. Brickwork cracked and sagging, windows shattered, vines clinging stubbornly to walls that no longer resisted. This was his inheritance. $20 worth of ruin. The smell of damp earth and rust followed him as he stepped out, boots crunching over broken glass. He circled the structure carefully, testing doors and studying damage, until he found a rusted side entrance that yielded under steady pressure. Inside, darkness swallowed sound. His flashlight cut a narrow path through dust and debris, revealing silent machines and long-abandoned workbenches. It felt intimate, almost sacred, like stepping into someone else's unfinished sentence. Every surface told a story of labor abruptly ended. Frank moved slowly, aware that the floor beneath him creaked with age. The air was heavy with mold and history. As he explored, he felt an unexpected connection to the place. Someone had worked here day after day, believing their effort mattered. A phone call interrupted the quiet, and Frank's heart stumbled when he saw his son's name on the screen. The conversation was tentative, emotional, and real in a way Frank had missed for years. News of an upcoming wedding, an invitation extended with caution, reopened a door Frank had believed permanently closed. Standing amid decay, hearing his son's voice echo through the hollow space, Frank felt something shift. This building was already giving him more than money. After the call, he noticed a staircase leading upward, partially hidden, and beyond it a heavy metal door unlike the others. The key turned smoothly. When the door opened, Frank stepped into a room untouched by ruin, sealed away from time, waiting. The air inside the locked room felt different, dry, preserved, almost deliberate. Frank's flashlight revealed shelves lined with carefully wrapped objects, each one placed with intention. Dust lay thick on the coverings, undisturbed for decades. He peeled back the first canvas and uncovered a wooden crate, then another, each labeled with dates written in neat, deliberate handwriting. When he opened one, straw packing gave way to hand-worked metal, intricate and impossibly precise. The craftsmanship stopped him cold. This wasn't scrap or junk. It was art shaped by patience and skill. Frank lifted piece after piece, each signed with the same name and year, each radiating quiet excellence. A journal lay among them, leather-bound and worn smooth. Inside, the pages held the voice of a woman who had dedicated her life to mastery while the world looked away. She wrote of discipline, rejection, and pride, of creating beauty even when no one noticed. Frank recognized that loneliness instantly. He had lived it. As he read, the room felt less like a storage space and more like a confession preserved in metal and ink. This wasn't a mistake or coincidence. The building had been kept for a reason. When Frank finally stepped back outside, the sun was already low, and his mind raced with possibilities he didn't yet understand. He sought advice from an antique dealer who handled the first piece with reverence, eyes widening as details revealed themselves. Words like significant and rare entered the conversation, followed by names of experts and institutions. Frank drove home in a daze, the toolbox beside him feeling heavier than its contents. That night, surrounded by fluorescent light and silence, he realized that the room he'd opened wasn't just physical. Something within him had been unlocked as well. The days that followed unfolded faster than Frank could process. Experts arrived, careful and excited, documenting every piece with gloved hands and measured voices. They spoke of forgotten schools of craftsmanship, of apprenticeships completed in eras that rarely welcomed women, of designs quietly absorbed into buildings without credit. Evidence surfaced showing that her work existed everywhere, seen daily by thousands, yet her name had been erased. Frank listened, anger and awe mixing in his chest. She had been brilliant and invisible, a contradiction he understood too well. When the letter she had written decades earlier was read aloud, Frank struggled to keep his composure. She had hoped someone would one day find her work and make sure she wasn't forgotten. Standing in that sealed room, surrounded by proof of a life devoted to excellence, Frank knew he couldn't fail her. Valuations followed, numbers so large they felt unreal. Hundreds of thousands, then millions. The same man who had counted grocery items and rationed gas now faced decisions about auctions, exhibitions, and legacy. Lawyers spoke carefully. Historians spoke passionately. Through it all, Frank thought about his son, about time lost, about chances missed. When he finally told his son the truth, not the numbers, but the meaning, he felt something heal between them. He quit 2 jobs without fear. He slept without alarms. He learned to breathe again. More importantly, he committed himself to honoring the woman who had trusted the future enough to leave her life's work sealed and waiting. Frank understood then that the inheritance wasn't the metal or the money. It was responsibility. It was a voice asking to be heard at last. As plans took shape, Frank found himself standing in rooms he'd never imagined entering. Museums, universities, galleries filled with quiet authority. Margaret's work was displayed beneath clean lights, admired openly, discussed seriously. Her name appeared in catalogs, on plaques, in academic papers. Frank watched strangers pause before her pieces, leaning closer, whispering appreciation. Each moment felt like a correction made to history. He attended meetings where professionals spoke of cultural impact and historical restoration, but Frank listened for something else. He listened for dignity. With guidance, he ensured that part of the collection remained intact, preserved not just as assets, but as testimony. Financial advisors spoke of security, of futures finally unburdened by fear. Frank paid debts, yes, but he also enrolled in classes he'd once thought were for other people. He learned to slow down. Conversations with his son became frequent, comfortable, filled with shared laughter and honest reflection. They spoke openly about grief and distance, about mistakes and forgiveness. Frank no longer measured his worth by hours worked. He measured it by presence. When journalists asked him how it felt to inherit such fortune, Frank corrected them gently. He hadn't inherited luck. He had inherited purpose. Each time he stood before Margaret's work, he felt as though he was keeping a promise on her behalf. She had believed someone might care enough to see her. Frank cared enough to make sure everyone did. On the day the exhibition opened, Frank arrived early, standing alone among the pieces before the doors opened to the public. He traced the curves of metal with his eyes, recognizing the patience embedded in every line. These were not objects made quickly or cheaply. They were declarations of belief in quality, in effort, in doing something right even when no one was watching. Frank thought about the years he'd spent unseen, cleaning offices before dawn, driving empty roads at night, believing that was all life offered him. He understood now that survival without meaning slowly erodes the soul. Meaning, he learned, often arrives disguised as inconvenience, risk, or loss. When the crowd entered, Frank watched from the back, unnoticed in content. A plaque bore Margaret's name clearly. That was enough. Later, his son joined him, pride evident in his expression. They stood together in silence, no words needed. Frank felt complete in a way money could never provide. He had given voice to the forgotten. He had reclaimed his own. The building that once seemed worthless had rewritten two lives, one long finished, one just beginning anew. Frank realized that legacy isn't about what we accumulate, but what we preserve and pass forward with intention. Some things wait decades to be understood. Some people wait even longer. Years later, Frank would still think about that envelope and how close he'd come to throwing it away. He would think about how easily fear and routine can convince a person that their story is already finished. Standing in the quiet of his home, no longer cramped or lonely, Frank understood that life rarely changes in loud, obvious ways. Sometimes it changes because you open a door everyone else ignored. Margaret had spent her life creating without recognition, believing her work mattered even when no one agreed. Frank had spent his surviving without believing he deserved more. In the end, their stories met at the exact moment each needed redemption. Frank learned that worth is not defined by visibility or profit, but by integrity and perseverance. He learned that it is never too late to honor what was overlooked, whether it's another person's legacy or your own potential. Most importantly, he learned that taking one uncertain step can alter the course of generations. Life does not reward those who wait quietly forever. It rewards those who choose, even once, to look closer instead of looking away. What you dismiss as worthless may be the very thing that restores meaning, purpose, and truth to your life. How many unopened doors are you walking past simply because you forgot how to hope?